Thank you. Okay, Brent, floor is yours.
Okay, fantastic. Welcome everyone. Hope that you had a good round 5. I suppose it was round 5. Just going to get into a motion debrief on the motion that we just went over. So again, I don't need to give a reminder on the wording, so I will skip that bit. But I do want to give a couple of disclaimers first, just before I get into a debrief on the different clashes in the debate, different kinds of claims that could have been made on each side. These disclaimers were given in motion debriefs yesterday, but just in case there are different people watching, so that we're all on the same page. First thing that does need to be noted and is quite important is obviously I do not have an all-encompassing knowledge of the claims and clashes that could be made in this round. And so just because something that you thought of or something that you thought was clever is not listed here is not necessarily any indication of its relative effectiveness or its worth in a debate like this. And that should be kept in mind in terms of the way that I'm talking through this. It's going to be a bit more of a general approach, and I'm sure debaters being fantastic and clever and creative as they are, there's many aspects to this motion that you could think of that perhaps I had not thought of individually. The second thing that I want to mention is in the event that there are things here that you also argued and potentially thought you made as arguments in a round, obviously that doesn't necessarily mean that that has an impact on the decision that you were given from judges. There are many, many different kinds of things going on in a debate round that impact a decision. And so argument selection is obviously only one portion of debate. The execution of those arguments and the broader engagement with the rest of the teams in the round and the comparatives there play a huge role. So with those caveats out of the way, let's try to talk through some of the material on each side in this debate. And I do think that in many ways, this is a debate where the clashes end up being fairly clear. And I think that there's definite material that each side has to approach those particular clashes. So I'll try to walk through them independently. There are also elements in which they are related, and I'll be clear about where I think that happens as well. So the first place that I want to focus on is anti-competitive behavior. Second will be on innovation, then on investment incentives and company failure. Lastly, just going over some, talking about like impacts that will be related to this on workers, consumers, etc. But let's start with just talking about anti-competitive behavior and how that broad clash could potentially be relevant on both the gov and op sides of this debate. So it seems a pretty important question in this round, the extent to which this tactic of trying to sacrifice short-term profit for long-term market capture will lead to or potentially disrupt market dominance, the kinds of which most of us would probably have some kinds of issues with because of the negative harms that they can end up creating, whether we're talking about monopolies, duopolies, whatever the case might be. I think that what some of the gov claims in this particular clash probably end up looking like is an idea that this tactic is used to, in many ways, artificially outcompete certain industries in a manner that leads to long-term consumer harm. So if you're using the example of Uber, for instance, in this particular instance, that charging really, really cheap rates for Uber rides might be good in the short term, but when taxi companies and other competitors end up being outcompeted and end up collapsing by virtue of a company like Uber using this tactic, it can lead to the emergence of monopolies or, again, other forms of perverse anti-competitive behavior that would have long-term negative repercussions as it impacts prices that consumers end up having to pay, the impacts on workers, as well as innovation, which we'll talk about a little bit distinctly in a second. Now, I also think, though, that this is not an exclusive claim to gov, because it's entirely possible for opposition to suggest that there are some ways in which the use of this tactic is good for disrupting anti-competitive behavior. The notion that this allows for a longer term type of investor and type of investment that isn't as prone to profit shocks that can occur when a bad quarter happens or when an investor gets a little bit spooked, because the types of people that are likely to be investing in using this kind of tactic are more likely to be viewing this as a long-term investment, and thus are going to probably not be as prone to big swings that can often happen within these kinds of markets. And the way that that ends up being relevant to anti-competitive behavior in particular is that there are hegemonic companies that exist within all kinds of different areas of economic life, right? Whether we're talking about Apple, Google, even one of the examples that ends up being used in the motion itself of Amazon, your capacity to compete against these types of companies, if you are starting a business that is using a is immediately trying to derive profits, is going to be far more difficult. And there's all kinds of ways that you can suggest that this type of approach is likely to give investors and people who are looking to disrupt markets an opportunity to enter markets that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to, or in situations where they would have had to sell off patents or innovations that they came up with to these larger companies who not even end up guaranteed to use them and can even end up holding them. So obviously the relevant question then becomes, at least in terms of anti-competitive behavior between these two teams, like the extent to which we believe some of the weighing that ends up having to happen about whether or not we think on Gov, this tactic is going to lead to the existence of more monopolies and the existence of more anti-competitive behavior, or whether we believe on Op that it's going to be used more as a mechanism of disrupting this behavior and creating fair markets. And that's obviously grounds for the debate, which leads me into kind of the second idea here, which is the question of innovation and which side gets better innovation more broadly. And this is obviously somewhat related to anti-competitive behavior, as the example that I just gave of patents should probably allude to. So the thing that I think that would likely be pointed out on Gov about the use of this tactic and the problem that can end up occurring is that if we end up having circumstances where we have monopolies or duopolies forming, then the pressures that they would face from competitors end up being stunted, and there is an extent to which they're not going to have to continue innovating after those initial innovations that potentially help them enter the market, and the problems that can end up resulting from that when you get this kind of degree of market capture early on. However, on Op, I do think that it's probably important to note that there's a lot of material about the issues that a profit-driven view of a company can create for those who are looking to reinvest and for those who are looking to try and focus on creating new products or caring about consumer welfare, right? Because if you have to have dividends and you have to be making payments to your shareholders, that does necessarily limit the extent to which you can reinvest this money or even take losses so that you can have more of that funding invested into what will end up leading to the kinds of innovations that would end up mattering. I think that the examples for innovation arguments, not just in this debate, but in debates overall, are pretty important to kind of make clear what the impacts are here and what ends up mattering. But innovation becomes a pretty clear area of clash as well between Gov and Op. Next, I think it's talking about company failure, because there's a basic question on both sides of the house about which of these models is more sustainable, both from the perspective of those who are investing, but also from just from the perspective of consumer welfare, right? If it is the case that Gov is able to demonstrate that this is an unsustainable strategy, or even that there is potentially some characterization about certain kinds of institutions and certain kinds of investors being more able to use this tactic than others in a way that can pervert competitive incentives, well, that definitely could lead to potential problems in relation to, I don't know, say these investments either in the immediate term not being successful and thus people not actually even getting to the stage of an IPO or something like that, or even in the long term not being able to sustain because of different types of incentives that you could talk about, whether it's the emergence of like copycats or some of the speculative nature of the way that these types of investments are often made with these particular kinds of companies. But a more perhaps specific and clear thing that Gov would likely talk about on the Gov side of the debate here would just be the harms that end up accruing when we end up having other companies. You can talk about this in the context of taxi companies or the context of these other institutions, because it's not always just going to be, as Op would frame it, these types of investments being used to combat Google and Apple. It's also going to be to capture market share in an area where there's a lot of local competition, right? People might not like taxi companies very, very much, but it's not, they're like a bunch of distributed specific local monopolies. It's not a national or an international monopoly. And there are probably very specific harms to those companies disappearing. Their workers potentially end up being paid less wages. It's just true that Uber and Lyft drivers, as an example, are paid far, far lower than their contemporaries were when taxi companies were more dominant. And so you can make, I think, a lot of arguments there about the impact that that can end up having on workers in particular. But if you flip that and you want to start talking about the op material, the consumer impact here, I think, is also important, right? The economies of scale that Amazon is able to leverage to be able to deliver things quickly and cheaply is dependent on, to a certain extent, them being able to not worry about profits to the same extent. And even if it isn't that the case now, it certainly was as they were trying to compete with others and trying to establish the business overall. And just the price of getting an Uber, although again, that's increasing in comparison to the price of getting a taxi 15 years ago, if you're a boomer like me, does show that there are a lot of negative impacts that can end up accruing, even just to consumers, from the cost of these types of services and the harms that necessarily end up coming from that. The last thing that I think that I'll mention here, just in terms of like the clashes and how this ends up impacting the arguments that end up being made, is I do think there's some interesting questions about the way that this makes investors think about these companies and the decisions that end up being made by the companies themselves. So on Gov, there can certainly be an argument made that there is a bit of a black box quality to companies. Uber's probably a better example here than Amazon, but it's a very common criticism made of Uber that there is this sort of long-term vision of Uber profitability that's kind of very difficult to refute or prove, right? It's the same criticism that is often made of Tesla, wherein if you don't have to show some kind of profit or you don't have to show some kind of dividend where you're actually succeeding and everything is speculative about what you could be or what could come at the end of the line, well, how is it that you're able to actually evaluate the degree to which these companies are providing what it is that they claim or accomplishing the things that they are supposed to be? And it gives a certain degree of like immunity to these companies to make decisions without being accountable for mistakes or failures in corporate governance. There's lots of ways that you can end up making this argument. On the other hand, this can easily be flipped by Op to suggest that the quarterly kind of like dividend interpretation of these companies has its own really negative and perverse incentives that I've alluded to already, and that those harms could just as easily be posed as big problems for the government side. So those harms would be things such as investors fleeing because of shocks in the market, right? Or the nature of people wanting to take on more equity rather than taking on loans, which also makes it so that there is a distinction in terms of how sustainable these companies are and the extent to which they can actually sustain going forward. So there's a lot of different elements in this debate. The last thing that I think I suppose I'll mention, because I think that I'm very, very close to going over my time here, is that you do need to probably ground these things very specifically on the impacts on workers, consumers, and companies themselves, and be very clear in terms of analysis why it is that your side uniquely is going to have better benefits for all of them, as would be true in any debate. And the last thing, and just as a note that I think is really useful for a motion like this, one thing to just be very wary of, and I was even guilty of this in the debrief that I just did, it's very common for CAs in a motion to use an example as an illustration to help people understand the context of the round and what it is that you are meant to be debating. The risk for you as debaters is that we then assume that the examples that are listed are the entire categorization of the debate, right? But clearly Uber and Amazon are not the only examples where this debate applies. And there can often be a lot of benefits to teams that realize that and try to expand as much as possible the scope of the debate, the places where it's going to take place, and the type of companies that are likely to use this, and the type of companies that are not likely to use this. And that can be quite clarifying in a round that is very, very likely, as I was, of massively overusing the examples that are listed in the motion in particular. So I wasn't timing myself super specifically, but I think that I'm just about up at time. So I hope that that was helpful for some people, and best of luck in the future of the tournament. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Brent, so much for this. Now, me and Hadar will do a quick session, and we will be talking about the CA work with the motion settings specifically. So if you're interested to listen, you can still stay with us. I think it's broadly that lots of people who are joining debating, they're not necessarily having much experience prior to their work in the CA team, and sometimes didn't realize how hard is that work. And this is not necessarily only the awardee on the privilege, but also big responsibility. And I think Hadar will start with giving some sort of overview, how the motions are testing, what needs to be ensured. This is also something which she wrote in the docs, which people were using for the other competitions, but you might find some insightful comments here. So we encourage you to stay with us for the next 15-20 minutes.
Okay, can I just check that I am fairly audible?
Yeah, all good.
Awesome. So what I'm going to cover today, and I'm going to do this fairly briefly, or at least like until Orcom tells me that I need to stop based on when the next round starts. I want to chat just a bit about the considerations that CAs have when setting a motion, and I'm going to flag a bit of what Brent did. Thank you so much, Brent, while doing so. To be clear, I am not part of the Korea Adjudicator. I have no access to any of the testing that was done, and I'm not speaking on their behalf. I think but giving you some insight on how we do these discussions may help both for prospective CAs in the future, as well as for speakers to understand why sometimes motions are worded the way they are, hinting at sometimes cases that you can find. So I think the first thing to discuss is just what do we look for in a good motion? The answer is that there are a lot of considerations. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but the basic principle that we are looking for here, does any team of the 4 teams in the debate have an equal or similarly equal chance at winning? And an important nuance here is not can any team win, but do they have a similar chance of doing so? And this would be the guideline questions we would ask ourselves when testing the motion. How do we do this? Many tests exist. The main one is actually similar to what you've just seen Brent do. So this is when we try to vent through ideas of what we would run in different motions while we are on an Adjudicator. Usually we would assign this role to more than one person to see that we are not entering some sort of group thing that just one person can do this, but all the rest of the Adjudicator as well. But otherwise, we will try to see what are the different arguments that we find on both benches of the debate. Based on finding these arguments, we'll try to assess their strength to compare between gov and opposition and see if they're sufficiently balanced, and also the depth and width of how many arguments we can find to assess if the motion is sufficiently balanced towards bottom half as well. Then, what do we do? Several important things. Rule of thumb, and it is a rule of thumb, which I'm going to caveat soon, we would usually look for about 5 strong arguments on each bench to assess that the motion is sufficiently deep and balanced. However, there are 2 caveats for this. The first caveat is the number 5 is a very flexible one. Sometimes motions can have more or less without them necessarily being as a result of this deep or not deep. I think something that Brent did as an example, which is good, is show how under similar clashes in the debate, such as the clash of innovation, the clash of market practices and competition, etc., there are different potential arguments to be made from team opposition or team government. Meaning that sometimes if an existing argument or clash is sufficiently deep for the possibility to have a lot of vertical extensions on it, we won't always need to have many separate clashes. It is advisable, but not a prerequisite. The second thing is, when we do look for the separate arguments, this cannot be any argument for us to determine that it is a sufficiently deep motion. Why? Flagging back to the guideline. The fact that someone can win the motion from every position does not mean that it is balanced. Sometimes a very good speaker can win a motion from every position, but still some positions would be easier than others. For this reason, it's not enough for us to evaluate that there are just 5 or any other number of arguments on each bench, but we need to compare them to different criteria of what we expect from these arguments. The first is they all need to be potentially debate winning. And I think something good that Brent did during the debrief as well is do different weighings of the different arguments and how you could have, from different teams in the debate, weigh them as potential paths to victory, which is another thing we would usually want to do when testing a motion. That is, an existence of an argument, if it is too weak, is not enough for us to say that the motion is deep. If bottom half only has a weaker clash to tap into, it will be too hard for them to weigh it compared to the top half. And then we would say that probably it is easier for the top half than it is for the bottom half. Similarly, on bench-wise, if both government and opposition has the same number of arguments, but opposition's arguments are significantly stronger, it's still obviously not a balanced motion. So the one thing that we want to evaluate is the strength of the different arguments that we find. The second thing we want to evaluate is how much independent those arguments are. If bottom half has an extension, say an impact, showing why the links already proven by top half lead to very nice impacts, in many cases, as I'm sure many of you have experience with, they might end up being deemed derivative. So in order to be able to know that bottom half has a sufficient chance to extend, we usually want to see that the arguments are not only winning in and of themselves, but they are independent of each other, that you don't need an existing argument to prove another argument on the bottom half. One good way to do this is also something that I think Brent exemplified very well, is using clashes. So not only running through the arguments in the debate, but also which clashes they play into. Usually if your arguments are 5 separate arguments which play into, say, 3 separate clashes, this would also mean, again, rule of thumb, that they are less likely to be contingent of each other, that they are in separate fields that mean that they don't have to be derivative eventually. The third thing we also want to test for is the ease of proof of different arguments. So again, both bench-wise and houses-wise, we want to make sure that the time that teams need to invest in their arguments is sufficiently similar. That is, if an argument exists and is independent and is potentially debate winning, but you need 7 full minutes to prove it because it has so many burdens of proof, as opposed to another argument, which is a very low-hanging intuitive fruit that you can grab in 2 minutes, it leaves the other side, even if the argument is equally strong, the other 5 minutes to do more arguments, rebuttals, weighings, etc. Time is the most limited resource in debate speeches, meaning if you need more time to prove a point, you will have a disadvantage. So the third criteria we're checking the arguments for is how easy it is to prove them, which is yet another reason why we also ask Brent to go briefly through potential ways to analyze the points to see how accessible it is. The third criteria that we'll then test for is also the accessibility of the arguments. An argument can be potentially sufficiently easy to prove and strong and debate winning and independent, but many teams will just not come up with it because it's very niche, because it requires expert knowledge, etc. Now, it is tempting for CAs to often say, if an argument is not accessible because team didn't come up with it, it's their fault. They should have come up with it, which is fair. And there is obviously a degree of responsibility we place on teams themselves. However, flagging back to the guideline we ask ourselves, we want teams to have an equal chance of winning. If one side have arguments which are very, very accessible and very easy to think of, and another side has mostly niche-based argument, that is again an imbalance. And in fact, we are asymmetrically penalizing one side for not having the knowledge without penalizing the other side in the same manner. So fourth metric we're going to wait for is also accessibility. Lastly, and this is less common, but just to flag, we also want to make sure that the arguments we are checking for in each bench aren't contradictory. So obviously, there are many different stances that often opening half teams can take. Sometimes you can want to oppose a motion because you want to go more radical or less radical than it, etc. That is important to know, though, that the existence of different arguments on potential bench in the debate that are under different stances is something that we should be wary of counting when we count the number of potential extensions. If top half took a stance, bottom half most often can't really contradict it. They can try and weigh a different metric, but they can't take a completely different argument that is completely in contradiction to the opening stance. So if the arguments on the bench are contradictory to each other, we cannot count them as separate lines of extensions or path to victory because the bench eventually will have to choose only one. These are the main guidelines of how we test motions in terms of finding them sufficiently balanced and deep. Then there are some other important considerations, which I think are especially important for majors. I think the first thing, and this is also something that speakers can use when they think of why a motion was worded in a certain way as opposed to another, is CAs want to set the motion to be sufficiently stable in different rooms. You're going to have top rooms and bin rooms, and speakers from many different circuits with different cultural contexts, etc. The motion is going to go to different directions in different debates. It's not going to be only the debate in your head. Someone will set a model that you did not expect. Someone might give a counterprop that you did not expect. Someone will think of the likely characterization differently than what the Adjudicator had in mind. It is important to think, especially in very large competitions, how a motion plays out in different contexts, in different countries, in different level of experience of teams, and so on. I think this also means that when you think of the wording of a motion, keep in mind that sometimes the CAs chose a specific wording over another with the thought in mind of making it less vulnerable to potential changes that could harm the balance of it. For example, not always, but often, if a motion is set as analysis, like this house opposes, rather than being set as policy, like this house would ban, which is sometimes an alternative, not always you can do it as a policy. Sometimes the reason for this would be because the CA team doesn't want OG to have a model fiat that could change the debate very much, but rather wants everyone to analyze the likely scenario. So this is one thing you can think of also as speakers to identify where the CA team wants you to go with this. Maybe there are different contexts in this debate that you should think of when characterizing the likely scenario. So also keep in mind, as speakers, the wording often hints at where the CAs wanted to direct the discussion, and as prospective CAs, the wording of the motion can also help you make sure that the motion is sufficiently balanced in different rooms. However, the caveat to this, which is important, we don't need to micromanage the way that speakers do the debates. The fact that the debates can go in different directions isn't inherently a bad thing. It's actually good. I think it's part of the originality and creativity of the game. It leads to new arguments being generated, and it's fun to find new ways that you could analyze the motion you thought of. The mere fact that the motion can be defined in different ways is not in itself a reason to block teams from trying to do this. We usually only do this when we have reasons to think that this is scary, that teams using this ability to change the motion could go in bad directions. For this, there are two main set of occasions in which we do that. The first would be motion breakers. So sometimes we would want to think, is there a way to set the motion or define it in a way that makes it imbalanced? A team that is very experienced will often be able to try and maybe mitigate the debate to the very specific clash, which is hard to win for other teams in the debate, or alternatively, try to define it in a way which becomes very hard to oppose, etc. This is what we think of when we want to think of, should we limit speakers, especially in like the high rooms and the out rounds, ability to potentially shift the debate from where it came. How do we test for it? That's a very good question. I won't go through all of the process now. The thorough method would just be to try and play the devils ourselves, try and think how we would try and break this motion if we would be a team trying to win it, and see if we come up with any potential loopholes that can be abused. A second thing is, there are rules of thumb. They are not always an indication of a motion breaker, but there are some motions which are less or more fragile than other kinds of motions. The more a motion is like intuitive and similar in different contexts, has a clear-cut policy to it, and grounded in people's intuition, the less likely it is to take very different directions. Motions which are more like experimental, which by the way, I love, I don't think it's an argument against putting experimental motions, but it is a risk that sometimes we run with them. So motions which are like sci-fi, preferring a different world, something that has a very big shift in people's intuition, has more potential loopholes just because of the fact that there are more things up for definition, more things that could change and could potentially be abused. This is not a reason not to set these motions. It is a reason to have like a red flag that you want to test them more for potential motion breakers and way to take them in directions you did not expect. The second thing to think of, and this is especially true in early in rounds, is sometimes inexperienced teams, due to lack of experience with debate or lack of familiarity with the topic at hand, might define the motion differently than you would expect, not because they are trying to break it, but just because they don't understand it as much. So sometimes, it is not an OG that tries to define a scroll because they want to break the motion, but they might even harm themselves with sometimes unstrategic models because they don't know the topic in reality and don't know that it's unstrategic. Now, again, it's tempting to say, well, if teams harm themselves, that's the team's problems, right? We need to penalize them for lack of merit. The problem is the way that the debate works, when a team changes the motion in a way that harms even itself, it usually impacts other teams as well. For example, if there is a model for the debate which is going to be inconvenient for government, CG is also bound to it. Similar for a stance that OO makes as a concession in the debate, and CO might be bound to it, etc. For this reason, especially in early in-rounds where often there is a lot of variance in the level of teams, so sometimes you have very big margins of different experience between top half and bottom half, you want to make sure the different definitions for this debate are not making it imbalanced or undebatable. This is usually why you probably have seen in past competitions that the first motion tends to be, and this is again, not a rule to always apply, but it tends to be sometimes more basic, a bit more similar to things we've done before, etc. Because we want it to be fairly safe in terms of less likely to be taken in directions which are hard for teams to defend. To be clear from everything I say so far, by the way, I'm not going to discuss fully how do we choose which motion is round 1, which motion is round 9, etc. The important thing is, don't take it as, some rounds are important to be balanced, and otherwise we can we cannot care about this. Like, because round 1 is random, we need to make sure of this, but we don't need to think of potential messy mechanisms in round 5 or something like that. All rounds in the competition always need to be balanced. It's not something that as CIs we can neglect responsibility of and say, oh, it's just round 1 or it's just round 5 or whatever. However, it does mean that in certain rounds we need to pay extra attention to some potential ways that the motion can go wrong. I believe I'm now out of time. These would be the main things I discussed for today, but I also highly encourage everyone who didn't do so yet to read the guidelines that Madrid UDC published on motion setting, which has it in much more detail. And best of luck, everyone, in round 6.
Thanks, Hadar. Thanks, everyone, for watching. I think this also emphasizes how hard is the word CAs only from the one perspective of the motions. And this is even not include like the panels creation and all of the other things. So I think sometimes it's good to be mindful that this is exactly hard work, and sometimes the delays which are created or like the issues are not necessarily because people might be not really good prepared, but there are also other sub things which need to be done in that regard. We wish you best of luck for round 6 and come back for the training tomorrow for the panel discussion, which will be announced soon, and then another debriefing in the short break. Good luck.